Is the USA moving towards the far right, especially under the unelected influence of Elon Musk? The political direction of the United States is a complex issue with multiple factors at play. While there are indications of a shift towards right-wing populism in certain segments of society, the country remains politically polarized, with significant resistance to far-right movements. There has been a growing influence of right-wing populism in the US, reflected in movements like Trumpism, increased restrictions on immigration, and culture war issues around topics like LGBTQ+ rights, race, and education. However, the country is not universally moving toward the far right. Many states, cities, and demographics are pushing back, with younger generations tending to lean progressive. Economic uncertainty, inflation, job insecurity, and concerns over globalization have fueled populist sentiment. Media and social networks, right-wing media ecosystems, particularly on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Rumble and Truth Social, amplify conservative messaging. Supreme Court decisions, recent rulings on issues like abortion and affirmative action, reflect a conservative judicial shift. Immigration backlash, concerns over border security, have been central to right-wing political narratives. Cultural battles, conservative politicians and influencers have capitalized on opposition to woke policies. Elon Musk, while not an elected official, holds substantial influence due to his control of X, his massive wealth, and his direct engagement in political discourse. Musk has increasingly aligned with right-wing figures, often amplifying conservative viewpoints and engaging in culture war debates. Twitter as a political weapon. Since acquiring X, Musk has reinstated previously banned right-wing figures, criticized progressive policies, and promoted free speech absolutism while allegedly tolerating misinformation. Direct political influence. Musk has engaged with right-wing politicians like Ron DeSantis and opposed figures like President Biden, leading some to argue he is shaping political narratives. AI and technology power. With control over key industries like Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and Starlink, Musk wields influence beyond politics, particularly in areas of national security and public communication. Despite Musk's influence, there are strong counterforces. Demographic changes. Younger voters tend to be more progressive. Political resistance. Biden's administration, Democratic-led states, and left-leaning organizations continue to push back against right-wing trends. Corporate influence. Many businesses still align with diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. The United States is experiencing a battle between right-wing populism and progressive resistance. Musk's role is significant but not singularly determinative. While his platform amplifies right-wing voices, broader political and social forces ensure that the country remains deeply divided rather than uniformly shifting to the far right. It is a fact that the USA is primarily controlled by big business owned by greedy billionaires who want more tax reductions while advocating policies on cuts on welfare, health, public services, and such like. There is strong evidence that big business and wealthy individuals wield significant influence over US policy, particularly when it comes to tax policy, deregulation, and reductions in public spending. However, the extent of their control is debated, and there are countervailing forces, such as labor movements, progressive politicians, and grassroots activism, that push back against corporate power. Large corporations and billionaires benefit from tax breaks, offshore accounts, and lobbying for lower corporate tax rates. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed by Donald Trump, significantly reduced corporate tax rates, benefiting the wealthiest individuals and businesses. Many of the ultra-rich, including Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, pay little to no federal income tax due to legal loopholes, deductions, and offshore holdings. Many right-wing and corporate-backed politicians advocate for reduced government spending on welfare, healthcare, and public services, while pushing for privatization. Policies aimed at cutting Social Security, Medicaid, and public education often originate from think tanks funded by billionaires, such as the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, and the Koch network. The push for private healthcare, charter schools, and deregulated industries benefits corporations at the expense of public programs. The Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010 allowed unlimited corporate and individual spending in politics, leading to dark money influence in elections. Industries such as Big Pharma, fossil fuels, and Wall Street spend billions lobbying Congress to shape policy in their favor. Organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, draft laws that politicians push into legislation, often favoring business interests over workers' rights or environmental protections. Billionaires like Rupert Murdoch of Fox News and Elon Musk of X, formerly known as Twitter, influence public discourse by shaping narratives that often favor deregulation and conservative policies. Media ownership concentrates power among a handful of corporations, reducing diverse perspectives in mainstream news. Despite billionaire influence, resistance exists. Progressive movements like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's platforms advocate wealth taxes, Medicare for all, and higher corporate regulation. Union power has resurged, with strikes at Amazon, Starbucks, and the auto industry pushing back against corporate greed. Younger voters lean more progressive and are skeptical of corporate overreach. While it is true that big business and billionaires exert outsized influence on US policy, the country is not entirely under their control. Political, social, and grassroots movements continue to challenge their dominance, though their success depends on mobilization and voter participation. The shift towards hardline far-right policies in the USA has also been mirrored in Western nations in Europe, particularly in France with the rise of the Fascist Party, and likewise in Germany, where far-right fascists are growing in support. Also in the UK with the Reform plc far-right and the likes of Tommy Robinson. Yes, there has been a noticeable rise in far-right and nationalist movements across Western nations, particularly in Europe. Economic anxiety, immigration concerns, and dissatisfaction with mainstream political parties have fueled this shift. While these movements vary in intensity and focus across different countries, the trend reflects a broader backlash against globalization, multiculturalism, and progressive policies. Marine Le Pen's National Rally, formerly the National Front, has grown significantly in influence. While it has tried to soften its image, its policies remain nationalist, anti-immigration, and Eurosceptic. The party has capitalized on public fears over immigration, crime, and national identity, particularly after terrorist attacks and economic instability. Recent polls show Le Pen and RN gaining ground, potentially challenging Macron's centrist policies in future elections. The Alternative for Germany Party, a far-right nationalist movement, has been gaining support, especially in Eastern Germany. AfD promotes anti-immigrant policies, Euroscepticism, and nationalism, often using rhetoric reminiscent of the Nazi era. Recent reports revealed secret far-right networks planning the mass deportation of immigrants, fueling fears of extremist influence. The German government has been investigating AfD's links to extremist groups and neo-Nazis. Reform UK, the rebranded Brexit party with Richard Tice, has positioned itself as an anti-immigration, anti-woke party. It appeals to disillusioned conservative voters who feel the current government is too moderate. Figures like Tommy Robinson, a far-right activist, continue to promote Islamophobia and nationalist rhetoric, often influencing right-wing movements through online propaganda. Several factors explain this resurgence: economic hardship, inflation, job insecurity, and dissatisfaction with the economic system drive people toward populist parties promising nationalist solutions. Immigration and demographics, fear-mongering over refugees and migrants, particularly from Muslim-majority countries, is a major talking point for far-right parties. Dissatisfaction with traditional politics. Mainstream parties, both left and right, have struggled to address social and economic grievances, pushing voters toward more radical alternatives. Social media and disinformation platforms like X, Twitter, and Telegram amplify far-right rhetoric, often spreading conspiracy theories and misinformation. Culture wars and identity politics. Opposition to progressive social changes like LGBTQ+ rights, multiculturalism, and gender policies has fueled reactionary movements. While many of these movements echo elements of historical fascism, such as nationalism, scapegoating minorities, and erosion of democratic norms, they also adapt to modern political landscapes. Unlike 20th century fascism, they often operate within democratic systems, using elections and digital influence to gain power, rather than direct coups. Despite these trends, opposition remains strong. In France, protests and left-wing alliances continue to push back against Le Pen's rise. In Germany, the government actively monitors and bans extremist organizations. In the UK, the Green Party and civil society groups challenge far-right narratives. The rise of the far right in the United States and Europe reflects broader political shifts driven by economic instability, cultural anxieties, and dissatisfaction with establishment politics. While these movements are gaining traction, they also face significant opposition. The future direction will depend on voter engagement, policy responses, and the ability of mainstream parties to address public concerns without resorting to nationalism and xenophobia. Italy has also experienced a significant shift toward the far right, particularly with the rise of Giorgia Meloni and her party, Brothers of Italy. This reflects a broader European trend of right-wing populism gaining ground, fueled by economic anxiety, immigration concerns, and disillusionment with traditional political parties. Meloni's Brothers of Italy, a party with roots in Italy's post-fascist movements, became the leading party in the 2022 general elections. She became Italy's first female prime minister, leading a right-wing coalition alongside Matteo Salvini's Lega and Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia. Meloni has presented herself as a nationalist, pro-family, anti-immigration leader, often using rhetoric critical of the European Union and multiculturalism. Brothers of Italy descends from the Italian social movement, a party founded by Mussolini's supporters after World War II. While Meloni publicly distances herself from fascism, she has never fully condemned Mussolini's legacy, and her party has retained neo-fascist symbolism. Far-right groups in Italy, such as Casa Pound, continue to promote nationalist and authoritarian ideas, aligning with some of Meloni's policies. Crackdowns on NGOs rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean, stricter border controls and deals with North African countries to curb migration, increased deportations and tougher asylum policies. Strong opposition to LGBTQ+ rights, with efforts to restrict same-sex parenting and adoption, promotes traditional family values, including financial incentives for Italians to have more children, which is often viewed as a response to demographic shifts. Attempts to rewrite history by downplaying Italy's fascist past in education. Initially critical of the EU, but has moderated her stance to maintain economic stability. Pushes for Italians' first policies in employment and welfare. Italy's shift is similar to what's happening in France with Le Pen Germany, with AfD, and the UK with Reform UK. However, unlike some of these movements, Meloni has successfully mainstreamed far-right politics by softening her rhetoric while still pursuing hardline nationalist policies. France's Le Pen has yet to win a presidential election, while Meloni already holds power. Germany's AfD remains controversial, whereas Meloni has gained legitimacy within the EU. The UK's Reform UK and Farage remain fringe compared to Italy's dominant far-right government, but are growing in support. Despite her popularity, Meloni faces strong opposition. Protests against her government's stance on immigration and LGBTQ+ rights. Left-wing and centrist parties trying to unify against the right-wing coalition. European pressure as the EU watches her policies closely. Italy is now one of the strongest examples of far-right governance in Western Europe, with Meloni successfully bringing nationalist and anti-immigration policies into the mainstream. While she presents herself as a moderate, her party's historical ties to fascism, hardline policies, and nationalist rhetoric align with broader far-right movements in Europe and the US. The question remains, will this shift last, or will opposition forces push back in future elections? The only way to counter the rise of the far right is for people to form communities and elect members from their own class who are not millionaires or billionaires, so that a new political movement can emerge that would truly represent the majority, instead of just the greedy aspirations of the very few extremely rich. Yes, one of the most effective ways to counter the rise of the far right is for ordinary people to organize, build strong communities, and elect representatives who come from the working and middle classes, rather than from the millionaire and billionaire elite. The current system in many Western nations is dominated by corporate-backed politicians who primarily serve the interests of the ultra-wealthy. To break this cycle, a new political movement rooted in genuine grassroots democracy is needed. Steps to counter the far right and build a people-powered movement. Build local networks focused on mutual aid workers' rights and community self-sufficiency. Support local activism against cuts to public services, privatization, and corporate greed. Educate and mobilize people on the dangers of far-right politics and its ties to the billionaire class. Push for politicians who come from ordinary backgrounds instead of career politicians or corporate elites. Challenge corporate influence in politics by promoting candidates who refuse billionaire donations and lobbyist funding. Support independent and grassroots parties rather than mainstream parties that often cater to the wealthy. Far-right movements often exploit working-class frustrations, but strong labor unions can offer an alternative by fighting for better wages, working conditions, and job security. Expand union membership and collective bargaining power to counter corporate exploitation. Promote cooperatives and worker-owned businesses instead of corporate-controlled economies. The far-right and billionaire-owned media use misinformation and fear to divide people. Create independent media platforms to expose corporate and far-right agendas. Support alternative journalism that highlights workers' struggles and grassroots movements. Advocate for higher taxes on the wealthy, universal healthcare, free education, and housing rights. Push for publicly owned services instead of privatization. Promote wealth redistribution policies to ensure fair wages and social safety nets. The far right is growing globally, so progressive and working-class movements must also unite internationally. Support anti-fascist and anti-racist organizations worldwide. Learn from successful movements in other countries, like Latin America's worker-led governments and Scandinavian social democracies. Corporate control of politics. The rich fund political campaigns, ensuring their interests dominate. Mainstream media manipulation. Billionaire-owned outlets push narratives that divide working people. Fear and apathy. Many believe change is impossible and disengage from politics. Divisive culture wars. The far right uses social issues to distract from economic exploitation. The majority of people, workers, students, small business owners, and marginalized communities, have far more in common with each other than with the billionaire class. The only way to truly defeat the far right is through grassroots organization, economic justice, and electing representatives who serve the people, not the ultra-wealthy. The key question is, will enough people wake up and take action before the far right cements its power?